The military, also called the armed forces, are forces authorized to use deadly force and weapons to support the interests of the state and some or all of its citizens. The task of the military is usually defined as defense of the state and its citizens, and the prosecution of war against another state. The military may also have additional sanctioned and non-sanctioned functions within a society, including the promotion of a political agenda, protecting corporate economic interests, internal population control, construction, emergency services, social ceremonies, and guarding important areas. The military can also function as a discrete subculture within a larger civil society, through the development of separate infrastructures, which may include housing, schools, utilities, food production and banking. The profession of soldiering as part of a military is older than recorded history itself. Some of the most enduring images of the classical antiquity portray the power and feats of its military leaders. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC was one of the defining points of Pharaoh Ramesses II's reign and is celebrated in bas-relief on his monuments. 1,000 years later, the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, was so determined to impress the gods with his military might that he was buried with an army of terracotta soldiers. The Romans were dedicated to military matters, leaving to posterity many treatises and writings as well as a large number of lavishly carved triumphal arches and victory columns. Etymology and definitions. Issue. Possibly cognate with thousand, cf. Latin and Romance language root word, mil. The first recorded use of the word military in English, spelled military, was in 1585. It comes from the Latin militaris but is of uncertain etymology, one suggestion being derived from *mil, it going in a body or mass. The word is now identified as denoting someone that is skilled in use of weapons, or engaged in military service or in warfare. In general, it refers to the physicality of armed forces, the personnel, equipment, and physical area which they occupy. As an adjective, military originally referred only to soldiers and soldiering, but it soon broadened to apply to land forces in general and anything to do with their profession. The names of both the Royal Military Academy and United States Military Academy reflect this. However, at about the time of the Napoleonic Wars, military began to be used in reference to armed forces as a whole, and in the 21st century expressions like military service, military intelligence, and military history encompass naval, marine and air force aspects. As such, it now connotes any activity performed by armed force personnel. History. Military history is often considered to be the history of all conflicts, not just the history of the state militaries. It differs somewhat from the history of war, with military history focusing on the people and institutions of war-making, while the history of war focuses on the evolution of war itself in the face of changing technology, governments, and geography. Military history has a number of purposes. One main purpose is to learn from past accomplishments and mistakes so as to more effectively wage war in the future. Another is to create a sense of military tradition which is used to create cohesive military forces. Still another may be to learn to prevent wars more effectively. Human knowledge about the military is largely based on both recorded and oral history of military conflicts, their participating armies and navies and, more recently, air forces. There are two types of military history, although almost all texts have elements of both. Descriptive history that serves to chronicle conflicts without offering any statements about the causes, nature of conduct, the ending and effects of a conflict, and analytical history that seeks to offer statements about the causes, nature, ending and aftermath of conflicts as a means of deriving knowledge and understanding of conflicts as a whole, and prevent repetition of mistakes in future, to suggest better concepts or methods in employing forces, or to advocate the need for new technology. Organization. In the whole history of humanity, every nation had different needs for military forces. How these needs are determined forms the basis of their composition, equipment and use of facilities. It also determines what military does in terms of peacetime and wartime activities. All militaries, whether large or small, are military organizations that have official state and world recognition as such. Organizations with similar features are paramilitary, civil defense, militia or other which are not military. These commonalities of the state's military define them. Command. The first requirement of the military is to establish it as a force with the capability to execute national defense policy. Invariably, although the policy may be created by policymakers or policy analysts, its implementation requires specific expert knowledge of how the military functions and how it fulfills roles. The first of these skills is the ability to create a cohesive force capable of acting on policy as and when required, and therefore the first function of the military is to provide military command. One of the roles of military command is to translate policy into concrete missions and tasks, and to express them in terms understood by subordinates, generally called orders. Military command make effective and efficient military organization possible through delegation of authority which encompass organizational structures as large as military districts or military zones, and as small as platoons. The command element of the military is often a strong influence on the organizational culture of the forces. Personnel. Another requirement is for the military command personnel, often called the officer corps, to command subordinated military personnel, generally known as soldiers, sailors, marines, or airmen, capable of executing the many specialized operational missions and tasks required for the military to execute policy directives. Just as in the commercial enterprises where there are, in a corporate setting, directors, managers and various staff that carry out the business of the day as part of business operations or undertake business project management. The military also has its routines and projects. During peacetime, when military personnel are mostly employed in garrisons or permanent military facilities, they mostly conduct administrative tasks, training and education activities, and technology maintenance. Another role of military personnel is to ensure a continuous replacement of departing servicemen and women through military recruitment, and the maintenance of a military reserve. Intelligence. The next requirement comes as a fairly basic need for the military to identify possible threats it may be called upon to face. For this purpose, some of the commanding forces and other military, as well as often civilian personnel, participate in identification of these threats. This is at once an organization, a system and a process collectively called military intelligence. The difficulty in using military intelligence concepts and military intelligence methods is in the nature of the secrecy of the information they seek, and the clandestine nature that intelligence operatives work in obtaining what may be plans for a conflict escalation, initiation of combat or an invasion. An important part of the military intelligence role is the military analysis performed to assess military capability of potential future aggressors, and provide combat modeling that helps to understand factors on which comparison of forces can be made. This helps to quantify and qualify such statements as China and India maintain the largest armed forces in the world, or that the U.S. military is considered to be the world's strongest. Although some groups engaged in combat, such as militants or resistance movements, refer to themselves using military terminology, notably, army, or front, none have had the structure of a national military to justify the reference, and usually have had to rely on support of outside national militaries. They also use these terms to conceal from the me their true capabilities, and to impress potential ideological recruits. Having military intelligence representatives participate in the execution of the national defense policy is important because it becomes the first respondent and commentator on the policy expected strategic goal compared to the realities of identified threats. When the intelligence reporting is compared to the policy, it becomes possible for the national leadership to think about allocating resources over and above the officers and their subordinates' military pay, and the expense of maintaining military facilities and military support services for them. Economics, more commonly referred to as defense economics. This is the financial and monetary efforts made to resource and sustain militaries, and to finance military operations including war. The process of allocating resources is conducted by determining a military budget, which is administered by a military finance organization within the military. Military procurement is then authorized to purchase or contract provision of goods and services to the military, whether in peacetime at a permanent base or in a combat zone, from local population. Capability development, which is often referred to as the military strength, is arguably one of the most complex activities known to humanity because it requires determining strategic, operational and tactical capability requirements to counter the identified threats, strategic, operational and tactical doctrines by which the acquired capabilities will be used, identifying concepts, methods and systems involved in executing the doctrines, creating design specifications for the manufacturers who would produce these in adequate quantity and quality for their use in combat, purchase the concepts, methods and systems, create a forces structure that would use the concepts, methods and systems most effectively and efficiently, integrate these concepts, methods and systems into the force structure by providing military education, training, and practice that preferably resembles combat environment of intended use, create military logistics systems to allow continued and uninterrupted performance of military organizations under combat conditions, including provision of health services to the personnel and maintenance for the equipment, the services to assist recovery of wounded personnel and repair of damaged equipment, and finally post-conflict demobilization and disposal of war stocks surplus to peacetime requirements. Development of military doctrine is perhaps the more important of all capability development activities because it determines how military forces were, and are used in conflicts, the concepts and methods used by the command to employ appropriately military skilled, armed and equipped personnel in achievement of the tangible goals and objectives of the war, campaign, battle, engagement, action or a duel. The line between strategy and tactics is not easily blurred, although deciding which is being discussed had sometimes been a matter of personal judgment by some commentators and military historians. The use of forces at the level of organization between strategic and tactical is called operational mobility science because most of the concepts and methods used by the military, and many of its systems, are not found in commercial branches. Much of the material is researched, designed, developed and offered for inclusion in arsenals by military science organizations within the overall structure of the military. Military scientists are therefore found to interact with all arms and services of the armed forces, and at all levels of the military hierarchy of command. Although concerned with research into military psychology, and particularly combat stress and how it affects troop morale, often the bulk of military science activities is directed at military intelligence technology, military communications and improving military capability through research. The design, development and prototyping of weapons, military support equipment, and military technology in general is also an area in which lots of effort is invested. It includes everything from global communication networks and aircraft carriers to paint and food. Logistics. Possessing military capability is not sufficient if this capability cannot be deployed for, and employed in combat operations. To achieve this, military logistics are used for the logistics management in logistics planning of the forces' supply tail, the consumables and capital equipment of the troops. Although mostly concerned with the military transport as a means of delivery using different modes of transport from military trucks to container ships operating from permanent military base, it also involves creating field supply dumps in the rear of the combat zone, and even forward supply points in specific units' tactical area of responsibility. These supply points are also used to provide military engineering services such as the recovery of defective and derelict vehicles and weapons, maintenance of weapons in the field, the repair and field modification of weapons and equipment, and in peacetime the life extension programs undertaken to allow continued use of equipment. One of the most important role of logistics is the supply of munitions as a primary type of consumable, their storage and disposal. Operations, while capability development is about enabling the military to perform its functions and roles in executing the defense policy. How personnel and their equipment are used in engaging the enemy, winning battles, successfully concluding campaigns, and eventually the war, is the responsibility of military operations. Military operations oversees the policy interpretation into military plans, allocation of capability to specific strategic, operational and tactical goals and objectives, change in posture of the armed forces, the interaction of combat arms, combat support arms and combat support services during combat operations, defining of military missions and tasks during the conduct of combat, management of military prisoners and military civil affairs, and the military occupation of enemy territory, seizure of captured equipment, and maintenance of civil order in the territory under its responsibility. Throughout the combat operations process, and during the lulls in combat, military intelligence provides reporting on the status of plan completion and its correlation with desired, expected and achieved satisfaction of policy fulfillment. Performance assessment. The last requirement of the military is for military performance assessment and learning from it. These two functions are performed by military historians and military theorists who seek to identify failures and success of the armed force and integrate corrections into the military reform with the aim of producing an improved force capable of performing adequately should there be a national defense policy review.